The first gunshot was a punctuation mark ending the long, drowsy sentence of a redemption afternoon. The second was the start of a new violent paragraph. Dust baked into a pale, shimmering powder by the Wyoming sun puffed from the boardwalks as boots scrambled for cover. Inside the Redemption Bank and Trust, the air turned thick with cordite and the raw metallic scent of fear. Jacob Vance was on his knees not in prayer, but because a rifle butt to the back of the head had put him there. His world swam in a nauseous haze, the polite chatter of the bank replaced by the guttural shouts of men and the splintering crack of wood. He was a simple ranch hand now, or so he told himself. He had come to town for salt licks and fence wire, not for this. Not for the past to come calling with dynamite and repeating rifles. 4 men, their faces obscured by dusty bandanas, moved with a brutal efficiency that spoke of long practice. But it was their leader who held the room in a state of suspended terror. He was a tall man dressed in a fine black coat that seemed to scorn the oppressive heat. He moved with a chilling theatrical grace, his voice calm and articulate as he directed his men. He wasn't just a robber. He was a conductor orchestrating a symphony of chaos. "The main vault is of no interest to us," the leader announced, his voice cutting cleanly through the whimpers of the terrified clerk. "The safe deposit boxes, gentlemen. That is our prize." Jacob blinked, trying to clear the fog from his head. He had heard that voice before, in a different life, a lifetime ago. A cold dread colder than any winter wind began to creep up his spine. He watched as 2 of the men dragged a heavy crate forward. Dynamite. They weren't picking locks, they were shattering them. The explosion was a physical blow, a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the building. Dust and paper rained down from the ceiling. The heavy iron door to the deposit vault buckled, torn from its hinges like a scab from a wound. The leader, Silas Thorne, stepped through the smoke, ignoring the scattered cash that littered the floor. His men followed, prying open the mangled boxes with crowbars, tossing aside deeds, jewelry, and family heirlooms with contemptuous indifference. They were looking for something specific. Jacob's heart began to hammer against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the ringing in his ears. He knew what was in Box 73. It was the only thing of value he had left in the world, though its worth couldn't be measured in gold. Thorne moved along the row of broken boxes, his eyes scanning the contents. He stopped a predator scenting its prey. He reached into one of the boxes and pulled out a small velvet pouch. With a delicate, almost reverent motion, he loosened the drawstring and let the contents fall into his gloved palm. It was a simple silver locket tarnished with age, its surface etched with the image of a single wild rose. Jacob felt the air leave his lungs. The world narrowed to that single point of silver in the outlaw's hand. It was Eliza's, his wife's, the only thing he had managed to pull from the ashes of their life, the only tangible piece of a memory that haunted his every waking moment. Thorne held it up to the light, a faint, cruel smile touching his lips beneath the bandana. Then he did something that confirmed Jacob's deepest fears. He turned his gaze sweeping the room, and his eyes pale and cold as a winter sky found Jacob's. He held the locket up for Jacob to see, a deliberate, intimate gesture in the midst of the chaos. It wasn't a robbery. It was a message, a declaration. The past was not buried. It had been waiting. Thorne pocketed the locket and gave a sharp nod to his men. "We are finished here." As they backed out of the bank, dragging the terrified clerk as a shield, the world rushed back in on Jacob. The ringing in his ears was replaced by the frantic shouts of the townspeople. He staggered to his feet, his body screaming in protest, and stumbled out into the blinding sunlight. He saw them mount their horses, their movements fluid and practiced. Thorne, the last to mount, paused. He looked back at Jacob, who stood swaying on the bank steps. Thorne slowly pulled down his bandana, revealing a face that was handsome, yet etched with a profound bitterness that seemed to have poisoned his features from within. He gave Jacob a slow, deliberate nod, a nod of acknowledgement of shared history, of a promise of pain yet to come. Then he spurred his horse and was gone, leaving Jacob Vance standing in a river of pale, shimmering dust, a disgraced former U.S. Marshal, whose carefully constructed anonymity had just been blown apart by the theft of a single, irreplaceable memory. The quiet life he had sought was over. A ghost from his past had just stolen the last piece of his wife, and Jacob knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he would have to become a ghost himself to get it back. The town of Redemption had a name born of hope and a reality forged from despair. It was a place where dreams came to die of thirst, its single main street a testament to ambitions that had dried up and blown away, like the dust that coated everything. When the chaos of the robbery subsided, it was replaced by a thick, impotent silence. Sheriff Brody's office was the epicenter of that silence. Brody was a man whose authority had long since been eroded by whiskey and compromise. He sat behind his desk, his tarnished badge a sad mockery on his sweat-stained vest, listening to Jacob's clipped, urgent report. The sheriff's face, a roadmap of burst capillaries, was a mask of weary resignation. 4 men, you say? Brody mumbled, making a half-hearted show of writing on a piece of paper. Took nothing but the contents of one box. Not just one box. Jacob corrected him, his voice low and tight. He stood before the desk, his frame casting a long shadow in the stuffy office. He had shed the persona of the quiet ranch hand. The steel of the U.S. Marshal he once was had begun to resurface. They blew the whole vault open. They took a locket. Mine. Brody sighed, setting his pen down. Look, Vance, I know you're new around here, but you gotta understand how things work. Silas Thorne owns this valley. He owns the biggest ranch, he owns the water rights, and if we're being honest, he owns me. You think I can ride out there and arrest a man like that over a piece of tin? The casual mention of Thorne's name confirmed what Jacob already knew. The unmasking wasn't just for him. It was a display of untouchable arrogance. He staged a violent robbery, terrorized this town, and nearly killed a man for that piece of tin. Jacob said, his voice dangerously quiet. That makes it your business, Sheriff. Brody leaned back his chair, creaking in protest. Thorne will say it was a misunderstanding. He'll say he was retrieving his own property. He'll produce a dozen men who'll swear they saw you lose it to him in a card game last week. What do I have? The word of a ranch hand against the king of this territory. It's a fool's errand, Vance. Let it go. Your wife is gone. The locket won't bring her back. The sheriff's final words struck Jacob like a physical blow. He felt the old familiar grief rise up hot and suffocating. For 5 years he had tried to outrun it, burying himself in the anonymity of hard labor, seeking a peace that never came. He had believed that if he kept his head down, if he pretended to be someone else, the past would leave him be. Now he understood his folly. The past wasn't something you could run from. It was a patient hunter, and it had finally tracked him down. He looked at the sheriff, at the man's weak, compromised eyes, and saw the futility of the law in a lawless land. The badge on Brody's chest was a decoration, not a shield for the innocent. There would be no posse. There would be no justice. Not from this man. Without another word, Jacob turned and walked out of the office, leaving the sheriff to his bottle and his conscience. The afternoon sun baked the main street, and the townsfolk who had watched him enter the sheriff's office with faint hope now averted their eyes, their silence a shared admission of their collective captivity. Jacob walked to the livery, his steps heavy with a resolve he hadn't felt in years. He bypassed his work wagon and went to the stall that held his horse, Hannibal, a powerful buckskin that had been his partner through 100 forgotten manhunts. The horse nickered softly as Jacob approached, sensing the change in the man. From a dusty footlocker in the corner, Jacob retrieved his past. He pulled out a worn leather gun belt and the holster molded perfectly to the shape of a Colt Peacemaker. The leather was dry and stiff, the silver buckle tarnished. He ran his thumb over the smooth, wooden grip of the pistol, the familiar weight of it in his hand, a grim comfort. It felt like shaking hands with a dangerous old friend. As he strapped the belt around his waist, the weight of it settled on his hips, a burden he had once sworn he would never carry again. It was the weight of his failure, the weight of Eliza's death, the weight of a life he had tried to erase. But now it was also the weight of purpose. He saddled Hannibal, his movements economical, and sure the muscle memory of 100 hurried departures taking over. He was no longer Jacob Vance, the ranch hand. He was U.S. Marshal Vance, again stripped of his badge, but not of his skills. The man who hunted Thorn would not be the broken shell who had sought refuge in redemption. It would be the man Thorn remembered, the man Thorn had come to challenge. As he led Hannibal out into the dying light of the afternoon, he knew he was crossing a line. He was leaving behind the fragile pretense of a new life and riding back into the wilderness of his old one. His inciting incident was not a command from a superior or a plea from a town. It was a quiet personal decision made in the face of a corrupt and broken system. He was the only law that mattered now. He would hunt Silas Thorn not just to retrieve a silver locket, but to uncover the truth of why a man would risk everything to steal a memory. He rode out of redemption as the bruised twilight sky began to swallow the horizon, a lone rider against a landscape that promised nothing but hardship and violent revelation. The trail left by Thorn and his men was a brutal scar upon the land, a clear display of their contempt for subtlety. They weren't trying to hide. They were leaving a path for him to follow. It was part of the game, an invitation into Thorn's world. Jacob accepted. For 3 days he tracked them across the vast, unforgiving plains, a landscape of skeletal sagebrush and cracked earth that stretched to the horizon. The wind whispered through the desolate emptiness, a constant mournful sound that echoed the hollow space in Jacob's chest. This was a different kind of hunting. It was a contest of wills fought across miles of sun-scorched territory. Jacob pushed himself and Hannibal to their limits, the skills that had lain dormant for 5 years slowly reawakening. He was older now, the ache in his bones a constant companion, his instincts dulled by grief and time. He was rusty, and he knew a single mistake could be his last. On the 3rd day, he found the first sign that Thorn was testing him. He discovered one of the gang's horses, its leg broken, left to die a slow death under the relentless sun. It was a cruel, wasteful act, but it was also a message. We are moving fast. Can you keep up? As Jacob put the suffering animal out of its misery with a single reluctant bullet, he felt a cold knot tighten in his gut. This was not just a chase. It was a dissection. Thorn was peeling back the layers of Jacob's new life, forcing him to confront the man he used to be. Later that day, he found the second test. One of Thorn's men, a young outlaw with more bravado than sense, had been left behind as a rearguard. The ambush was clumsy, a poorly chosen spot behind a rocky outcrop. The rifle shot went wide, kicking up dust a yard to Jacob's left. The Jacob of 5 years ago would have anticipated it a mile off. The Jacob of today reacted a half-second too late, diving from his saddle as a second shot seared the air where his head had been. The ensuing gunfight was short and brutal. It was not a heroic duel. It was a desperate, clumsy scramble for survival. Jacob's hands trembled as he returned fire, the recoil of the Colt, a jarring, unfamiliar shock. He moved from cover to cover, his lungs burning, the rust on his skills scraping away with every shot. He finally got the better of the ambusher, a single shot that ended the man's life with a sickening finality. As he stood over the body, the smell of gunpowder sharp in the dry air, he felt no triumph, only a deep, weary sorrow. He was a lawman, not a killer, but the distinction was blurring with every mile he rode deeper into Thorne's territory. On the dead man's body he found something that changed the nature of his quest entirely. Tucked into a saddlebag was not ammunition or whiskey, but a heavy leather-bound ledger. Jacob opened it, his brow furrowing as he scanned the pages. It was meticulous, filled with names, dates, and figures. It was a detailed account of Thorne's real business. It documented fraudulent land claims, illegal water diversions, and intimidation tactics used to force small ranchers into selling their property for pennies on the dollar. The names in the book were a roll call of the broken men Jacob had seen in redemption, and their faces etched with the worry of drought and debt. Thorne wasn't just a rancher. He was a cancer systematically strangling the life from the entire valley. The ledger was a weapon proof that could dismantle Thorne's empire. But its presence here on the body of a common thug made no sense. Why would Thorne allow such a critical document to be carried so carelessly? The answer hit Jacob with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't careless. It was another move in the game. Thorne wanted him to find it. He was deliberately broadening the conflict, raising the stakes from a personal vendetta over a locket to a war for the soul of the valley. He was drawing Jacob deeper into his web, ensuring that even if Jacob succeeded, he would be entangled in a fight far larger than himself. Clutching the ledger, Jacob understood. Thorne wasn't just running. He was leading him, guiding him toward a final confrontation of his own choosing. And the path led directly toward the foreboding line of deep red rock formations on the horizon. And the crimson bluffs, the threshold to the sacred lands of the Stone Creek people. The wound was not from a bullet, but from a fall. Pushing himself too hard, his mind clouded by fatigue and the ledger's damning revelations, Jacob had let Hannibal stumble in a dry wash. The horse was unharmed, but Jacob landed hard, a jagged piece of rock tearing a deep gash in his thigh. He patched it as best he could, but the bleeding was persistent, and a fever began to coil in his gut. He pressed on, his vision blurring the landscape, warping into a feverish dream. He knew he was in Stone Creek territory now. The air felt different, ancient, and watchful. This was a land that had resisted every attempt at conquest, its people guarding their isolation with a fierce, unyielding reputation. He finally collapsed his strength, giving out his world, dissolving into a haze of pain and shimmering heat. He awoke to the scent of wood smoke and sage, the feeling of a soft buffalo hide beneath him. He was in a large circular lodge, with a dim amber light filtering through stretched hides painted with intricate symbols. A cool, damp cloth was on his forehead. A figure sat by the central fire pit, grinding herbs with a smooth stone. It was a tall, broad-shouldered man, his face carved from the same stoic patience as the land itself. His long, dark hair was braided, and his eyes, when they turned to meet Jacob's, held a deep, quiet authority. "You are in the heart of the Stone Creek lands," the man said. His English was formal, precise. "I am Cale. You collapsed at our border. My hunters found you." Jacob tried to sit up, but a sharp pain lanced through his leg. Kyle rose and came to his side, offering a cup of water. "Be still. The wound is deep. You have a fever." As Jacob drank, another man entered the lodge. He was younger, his features sharper, his eyes burning with a fierce, unconcealed hostility. "The white man wakes." The newcomer Torin said, his voice laced with contempt. "Our chief plays nursemaid to a trespasser. Why do we not leave him for the wolves, Cale? His kind has brought us nothing but misery." He is a man, Torin, not a political statement. Kyle replied, his voice calm, but edged with steel. And he was wounded. My concern is the fever, not the color of his skin. Torin scoffed, then his eyes widened as he saw something tacked to the lodge pole near the entrance. It was a piece of paper, a wanted poster. He strode over and ripped it down, shoving it in Kyle's face. Perhaps this will change your mind. Kyle took the poster. Jacob's blood ran cold as he recognized the crude sketch of his own face. The words beneath were stark. Wanted Jacob Vance. For bank robbery murder. 500 reward. He is not just a trespasser. Torin spat. He is a criminal. Thorne's men posted these all over the valley. They say he robbed the bank in redemption and killed a man. You have brought a wolf into our camp, Kyle. Kyle looked from the poster to Jacob, his expression hardening. The quiet authority in his eyes was now joined by a deep, troubled suspicion. Before Jacob could form a defense, the lodge flap opened again. An old woman entered her face, a beautiful map of wrinkles. It was Lyda, a tribal elder. She carried a bowl of poultice, but she stopped when she saw the tension in the room. "What is this?" she asked in her native tongue, her voice surprisingly strong. "This man is wanted by the whites," Torin explained, gesturing to the poster. "He brings their violence to our doorstep." Jacob knew he had to speak to fight the lie. "Thorne is the robber," he said, his voice raspy. "He framed me. He came for something of mine, something that belonged to my wife." He knew it was a desperate, unbelievable story, but it was the truth. "A silver locket," he added, his voice barely a whisper, "with a wild rose etched on it." At the mention of the locket, Lyda went still. Her eyes, clouded with age, sharpened with a sudden, intense focus. She looked at Jacob, truly looked at him for the first time. She spoke slowly in her own language, her words causing Kyle's expression to shift from suspicion to stunned disbelief. Kyle turned to Jacob, translating her words. "Lyda says she knows of such a locket. She asks what your wife's name was." "Eliza." Jacob breathed, his heart pounding. Her name was Eliza. Kyle relayed the name, and Lyda let out a soft gasp. She began to speak again, her voice low and urgent, her eyes fixed on Jacob. The story she told unraveled the very fabric of Jacob's grief, reweaving it into a tapestry of doubt and terrible suspicion. Many years ago. Kyle translated, his voice now heavy with a strange new gravity. Just after the first fences from the white ranchers began to appear, a woman was seen near our lands. Lyda saw her from the bluffs. She was with a man, a tall, well-dressed man who was not her husband. They were arguing. The woman was beautiful, with hair the color of the sun, like my own wife's. Lyda remembers because the woman was wearing a silver locket that caught the light. Jacob's world began to tilt. Eliza, with a man. Here it was impossible. She was seen near the old canyon. Kyle continued, his eyes locked on Jacob's. "The same canyon where you said your wife died. The official story was a carriage accident, a tragic fall." Lyda spoke one final sentence, her voice filled with a sorrowful certainty. Kyle's gaze was piercing. "Lyda says the man she was with, the man she was arguing with, was Silas Thorne." This was the midpoint twist, a revelation that shattered everything Jacob thought he knew. The official report had been clear. Eliza had been traveling alone. Her carriage had lost a wheel near the canyon, a freak accident. But Lyda's story planted a seed of horrific doubt. Was it possible Eliza hadn't been alone? Had Thorne been there on the day she died? The fight was no longer about a stolen locket or a criminal's ledger. It was about the truth of the last day of his wife's life. Thorne's obsession with the locket wasn't a random act of cruelty. It was a connection to a secret Jacob had never known existed. He had been hunting a thief, but now he realized he might have been hunting his wife's killer. Thorne, ever the master strategist, did not wait for Jacob to recover. His network of spies and paid men was as vast as his land holdings. The news that a wounded man, matching Jacob's description, had been taken in by the Stone Creek tribe reached him within a day. For Thorne, this was not a setback. It was the perfect opportunity to close his trap. He rode not to redemption, but 20 miles east to a temporary cavalry encampment. There he presented himself to Captain Lawrence, a young by-the-book officer eager to prove his mettle. Lawrence listened with stern attention as Thorne spun his carefully crafted tale. "Captain, my name is Silas Thorne. I am a rancher, a pillar of the community in these parts." He began, his voice a perfect blend of concern and authority. "A great tragedy has befallen us. The bank in Redemption was robbed by a desperate man, a former U.S. Marshal named Jacob Vance. He killed a man in his escape." Thorne paused, letting the weight of the lie settle. "We tracked him, but he has taken refuge with the Stone Creek hostiles in the Crimson Bluffs. And worse, Captain, much worse. He has my wife. He abducted her during the chaos. She is a hostage, a defenseless woman in the hands of a violent killer and the savages who shelter him." Every word was a poison dart. He painted Jacob as a fallen hero turned monster, and the Stone Creek, a people who had maintained a fragile, isolated peace, as complicit hostiles. To an outsider like Captain Lawrence, who saw the world in clear lines of order and chaos, citizen and savage, the story was entirely plausible. An ex-marshal, Lawrence questioned, his blue eyes sharp and analytical. "That's a serious claim." "He was disgraced years ago," Thorne said with feigned reluctance. "A tragedy. It broke him. I fear his mind is gone. Now he has allied himself with the very elements he once swore to fight. I beg you, Captain, for the sake of my wife, for the sake of civilization in this territory, you must act. Your authority is the only thing that can prevent a massacre." The plea was masterful. It invoked duty, honor, and the protection of the innocent. Captain Lawrence, bound by his orders to maintain peace and protect American citizens, saw a clear mandate for action. He had no reason to doubt the word of a prominent landowner. He had every reason to be suspicious of an isolated native tribe harboring a wanted fugitive. "Mr. Thorne," Lawrence said, his jaw set with military resolve, "I will assemble a detachment. We ride at dawn. We will retrieve your wife and apprehend this fugitive Vance. You have my word." The trap was now set. 3 forces were converging on the Stone Creek lands, each with a different truth. Thorne, the architect of the conflict, sought to reclaim his secrets and eliminate his enemies. Captain Lawrence, the instrument of the law, sought to restore order and rescue a hostage. And Jacob, trapped in the eye of the storm, now faced a second, more formidable obstacle. He wasn't just a fugitive from Thorne's lies. He was now a target of the United States Army. His only hope for survival and for uncovering the truth about Eliza rested on convincing 2 men from 2 different worlds to trust the word of a wanted man, a wary tribal chief who had every reason to hate him, and a duty-bound soldier who had every reason to kill him. The valley was no longer just a hunting ground. It was about to become a war zone. The revelation from Lida hung in the air of the lodge, thick and suffocating. Jacob's fevered mind reeled, trying to reconcile the woman he had loved with the stranger in Lida's story. Eliza, meeting Thorne in secret, it felt like a betrayal that reached back from beyond the grave. Yet the memory of Thorn holding the locket, the chilling intimacy of the gesture, now made a terrible kind of sense. Kyle watched him, his expression unreadable. The wanted poster called Jacob a criminal. The elder's story painted him as a cuckolded fool. Neither inspired confidence. My wife was a good woman. Jacob rasped, his voice raw with a mix of grief and newfound doubt. She would not. She had no reason to meet with a man like Thorn. Perhaps, Kyle said, his voice even. Or perhaps there are things a husband does not know. My people have a saying, every person has two hearts. One they show to the world, and one they keep for themselves. The words stung, but Jacob knew Kyle was right. He had been lost in his work back then, a marshal consumed by duty, often gone for weeks at a time. Had Eliza been lonely? Had Thorn, with his wealth and charm, offered her something Jacob could not? The thought was a venomous serpent coiling in his gut. I have to know the truth, Jacob said, looking at Kyle, his eyes pleading. The cavalry is coming, I know it. Thorn will have sent them. He'll paint me as the villain, you as his accomplices. He's using my past to destroy your future. He pushed himself up, ignoring the searing pain in his leg. He held out the ledger he had taken from the dead outlaw. This is his heart, Jacob said, offering the book to Kyle. The one he shows the world, full of greed and lies. It proves he is the criminal, not me. It can save your people, but only if Lawrence will listen. And he won't listen to me while I have a price on my head. He might listen to you. Kyle took the ledger, his long fingers tracing the unfamiliar script. He could not read the words, but he understood the maps marking the creeks, his people's creeks, with lines of ownership. He understood the cold arithmetic of conquest. Torrin stepped forward, his hand on the hilt of his knife. It is a trick, he warned. He wants to use you, Kale, to make you fight his battle. We should give him to the soldiers. It is the only way to save ourselves. And what happens after they take him? Kale countered, his gaze sweeping over his anxious warriors who had gathered at the lodge entrance. Do you think Thorn will simply thank us and leave our lands in peace? This man, he gestured to Jacob, is an excuse. Thorn has wanted this valley for years. If it wasn't Vance, it would be a stolen cow or a broken fence. The wolf does not need a reason to attack the sheep. He only needs an opportunity. He turned back to Jacob. You ask for my trust, but my trust is a precious thing, Marshal. It has been broken by your people too many times. He paused, his dark eyes searching Jacob's. Tell me of your wife. Tell me of the heart you knew. Convince me the man in that wanted poster is a lie. It was a test, a demand for the truth, stripped of all artifice. Jacob swallowed the story of his failure, a bitter pill in his throat. He spoke, his voice low, the words dragged from a place of deep, unhealed pain. We met in St. Louis. I was a young marshal, full of fire and certainty. She saw the good in me, even when I couldn't see it myself. The locket? I gave it to her on our wedding day. She never took it off. He looked down at his hands. The job took me away. I was hunting a gang, the Miller brothers. Vicious killers. I tracked them for months. I finally cornered them in a small town in the foothills not far from here. I had them trapped in a saloon. He paused, the memory as vivid as if it were yesterday. My captain's orders were clear: wait for reinforcements. Do not engage alone. Protocol. The law. I was a good soldier. So I waited. His voice broke the professional calm of the lawman, cracking to reveal the broken husband beneath. But the Millers got desperate. They took hostages. They tried to shoot their way out. The crossfire, It spilled into the street. Eliza. She was coming to meet me. Her carriage was just arriving in town. She was caught in it. The lodge was silent, the crackling of the fire, the only sound. I followed the rules. Jacob whispered the words, a confession. I waited for backup that came too late, and my wife paid the price for my obedience. That's why I lost my badge. That's why I came here, to forget the man who chose the law over his own family. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting Cale's. There were no tears, only a vast, empty landscape of grief. That is the truth of me, Chief. I am not the killer on that poster. I am the fool who wasn't there when his wife needed him most. Cale stood for a long moment, the silence stretching taut. He had heard the truth he sought, not in the details of the story, but in the profound, undeniable weight of Jacob's sorrow. He too was a leader who had lost his wife, a man who felt the crushing burden of being unable to protect the one he loved. In Jacob's story, he saw a reflection of his own pain. They were from different worlds, but they were brothers in grief. Lida, Kyle said, turning to the elder. Prepare a travois. Torin sends scouts to the eastern ridge. I want to know every move the soldiers make. We will meet them. He looked back at Jacob, a final decision made. We will meet them together. An alliance was forged, not on a promise of victory, but on a shared understanding of loss. The chief of the Stone Creek and the disgraced marshal would stand as one, not just to fight for the land, but to fight for the truth, a truth that was now inextricably bound to the memory of a woman named Eliza. The wind began to shift, carrying with it the first faint scent of rain and a palpable sense of dread and awe. A dark line of clouds was gathering on the western horizon, mirroring the line of blue-coated soldiers advancing from the east. The world was shrinking, the vast wilderness compressing into a single claustrophobic stage for the final act. Kyle chose the ground for the confrontation with the wisdom of a man whose ancestors had fought and died on this land for 1,000 years. It was a wide, shallow box canyon, a natural amphitheater carved from the red rock. There was only one way in and one way out. It was a place of strategic advantage, but also a trap. Whoever entered would be committed. As Cale's warriors fanned out, taking up positions high on the canyon rims, silent and invisible, as ghosts, the first fat drops of rain began to fall. The approaching dust storm, a common terror of the high plains, was accelerating, turning the sky a bruised, sickly yellow. Down on the canyon floor, the final preparations were made. Jacob, his leg tightly bound, leaned against a travois, the ledger tucked safely inside his coat. He was weak, but his mind was clear-sharpened by the imminent danger. He stood beside Cale, the two of them a strange and potent symbol of defiance. They will not expect this. Kyle said, his eyes scanning the canyon entrance. They expect us to hide or to attack them on the open plain. They do not expect a formal reception. The cavalry arrived first, a disciplined column of blue and brass, their movements precise and professional. Captain Lawrence rode at their head, his face set and serious. He halted his men just outside the canyon mouth, his eyes taking in the scene with a soldier's cautious appraisal. He saw only 2 men and a wounded man's litter waiting for him. It was an unnerving sight. Minutes later, Silas Thorne and his men rode up their approach, a stark contrast to the cavalry's discipline. They were a ragged collection of hired guns, their faces hard and cruel. Thorne reined in his horse beside Lawrence, a triumphant smirk on his lips. "There he is, Captain," Thorne said, pointing at Jacob. "The fugitive, and the chief who harbors him. It seems they mean to surrender." "It does not feel like a surrender, Mr. Thorne." Lawrence replied coolly, his gaze sweeping the silent, watchful canyon walls. He could not see Cale's warriors, but he could feel them. "I am Captain Lawrence of the United States Army," he called out, his voice echoing off the rock. "I am here for the fugitive Jacob Vance and the hostage Mrs. Amelia Thorne." The name was a shock. Amelia Thorne. Not Eliza. The lie was even more elaborate than Jacob had imagined. Before Cale could respond, Thorne spurred his horse forward, unable to contain his victory. "Jacob, it's over," Thorne shouted, his voice dripping with false magnanimity. "You've caused enough trouble. Release my wife and perhaps the law will show you mercy." It was at that moment, as the wind began to howl, whipping dust and rain into a swirling vortex, that the truth was finally revealed, but not in the way anyone expected. "Your wife," Jacob called back, his voice ragged but strong. "The only wife I see here is mine, Silas, the one you were with the day she died." Thorne froze. The triumphant smirk on his face vanished, replaced by a look of pure shock. He had controlled this narrative from the beginning, but this was a detail he had thought buried forever. "What nonsense is this?" Captain Lawrence demanded, turning to Thorne. The dust storm hit with the force of a physical blow, plunging the canyon into a chaotic twilight. Visibility dropped to a few feet. The swirling dust choked the air, making every shadow a potential threat. Men shouted, horses whinnied in panic. It was the perfect cover for violence. Through the maelstrom, Thorne's voice, now stripped of its eloquent charm and filled with a raw, guttural rage, cut through the wind. "You were never supposed to know." He screamed, his words barely audible over the storm. He drew his pistol, his silhouette a dark shape in the swirling chaos. "I should have killed you then." He fired the muzzle flash, a brief angry star in the gloom. The shot went wide. An arrow loosed by Cale from inches away struck Thorne's forearm, causing him to cry out in pain and drop the gun. It was then that Thorne, wounded and cornered, finally unleashed the ultimate devastating truth. The confession was not a whisper. It was a roar of agony and hatred hurled against the storm. "We were partners. We were partners, Jacob Marshalls," he bellowed, clutching his bleeding arm. "We were supposed to be brothers." Captain Lawrence, struggling to control his horse, stared in disbelief. "That raid on the Miller gang, you remember it, don't you?" Thorne's voice was a ragged torrent of grief and fury that had been festering for years. "You and your damnable rules. Wait for backup, Silas. Follow protocol, Silas. You stood there hiding behind your badge and your orders while they were dying." "What are you talking about?" Jacob yelled back, his mind refusing to process the words. "They weren't just killing random hostages." Thorne shrieked, his face contorted into a mask of pure tragedy. "My wife, my son, they were on that stagecoach, the same one Eliza was meeting. The Millers took them all. I begged you, Jacob, I begged you to go in. But you wouldn't. You let them die. You let my whole world burn because you were a coward, hiding behind a rule book." The world stopped. The howling of the wind, the panicked shouts, it all faded away. The truth hit Jacob with the force of the explosion at the bank, shattering the foundations of his own history. Eliza hadn't been meeting Thorne. She had been a hostage alongside Silas's own family. His memory of the event was a blur of chaos and gunfire, but Thorne's words painted a new horrific picture. Had he seen other faces in the carriage window? Had he, in his rigid adherence to protocol, ignored a plea from his own partner? My family. Thorne sobbed, the sound a terrible mix of rage and heartbreak. Gone. And you? You gotta walk away with your grief and your noble story of a tragic accident. An accident, I buried an empty casket. Jacob, there was nothing left, so I built this, all of it. He gestured wildly into the storm, at the land, the power, the cruelty. I built it all just to tear your world down, piece by piece. The land, your name, your last memory of her. It was all for this. For you to feel what I felt. To lose everything because of the one you trusted most. The primary climax twist was revealed. This was never about land or a locket. It was a tragic, elaborate act of revenge, born from a shared moment of catastrophic loss. Silas Thorne was not a monster born of greed, but a good man, broken by grief, twisted into a villain by a tragedy that Jacob himself had helped create. The locket wasn't just a memento of Eliza. It was a symbol of everything they had both lost in a single horrifying afternoon because of one fateful protocol-driven decision. The bullet Jacob had been running from for 5 years wasn't a memory. It was the truth. The dust storm raged, a physical manifestation of the chaos that had just been unleashed. In the heart of it, the lines between hero and villain, lawman and outlaw, dissolved into the swirling grit, leaving only two broken men partners in a tragedy that had finally come full circle. Thorne's confession, a raw scream of pain against the wind, had done more damage than any bullet could. It had killed the past Jacob thought he knew, and with it, the man he thought he was. As Thorne's last terrible words echoed in the canyon, the storm seemed to pause, as if holding its breath. In that moment of relative quiet, Captain Lawrence, his face grim under his rain-soaked hat, finally understood the terrible scope of the drama he had ridden into. This was not a simple matter of law and order. It was a wound that had been festering for years, and it had just burst open. Thorne. Lawrence bellowed, his voice the clear, commanding ring of military authority. Drop your weapon. It's over. Blinded by rage and grief, Thorne lunged for his fallen pistol. Before he could reach it, a shadow detached itself from the rocks above. Torin, moving with the lethal grace of a hawk, dropped down behind Thorne, subduing him with a single brutal blow from his bow. Thorne collapsed not with a bang, but with the weary sigh of a man whose long war was finally lost. The storm broke. The wind died down, and the dust began to settle, revealing the scene in the rain-washed light. Cale's warriors emerged from the canyon walls, their silent presence a testament to their discipline. Lawrence's troopers, shaken but resolute, rounded up Thorne's bewildered henchmen. The confrontation had ended not in a bloody battle, but in the devastating weight of a revealed truth. Captain Lawrence dismounted his boots, sinking into the wet red earth. He walked over to Jacob, who was still slumped against the travois, his face a pale mask of shock. Lawrence looked at the ledger Jacob held out, then at the defeated figure of Silas Thorne being bound by his soldiers. His confession, the ledger. It's enough. Lawrence said, his voice quiet but firm. There will be a full investigation. Justice will be done, Marshal. He used the old title with a newfound respect. He then turned to Cale. My orders were to apprehend a fugitive and rescue a hostage. It seems I was given false information on both counts. You and your people are not the enemy here. He offered his hand to the chief. Kyle looked at the offered hand, a symbol of a world that had brought his people so much pain. And then he looked at the captain's eyes and saw not a conqueror, but a man of honor trying to navigate a moral quagmire. He clasped Lawrence's hand firmly. Peace is all we have ever asked for, Cale said. The falling action was quiet and somber. As the cavalry led Thorne and his men away, Jacob and Cale stood together, watching them go. The rain had stopped, and the air was clean and cold. His pain made him a monster, Kyle said, his voice a low rumble. Yours made you a hermit, Two men, one tragedy. I never knew. Jacob whispered the words, still tasting like ash. I was so lost in my own grief, I never saw his. I followed the law, and it cost me everything. It cost him everything. He was not just a victim of tragedy. He was its co-author. The realization was a burden heavier than any grief he had ever carried. Jacob did not ride off into the sunset. The man who left the canyon was not the same one who had entered it. He could no longer run from his past. He had to confront it to atone for it. He returned to redemption not as a broken ranch hand, but as a man with a purpose. He handed the ledger over to the federal authorities who arrived in Lawrence's wake, providing sworn testimony that dismantled Thorne's corrupt empire, piece by legal piece. He used his knowledge of the law not to hunt men, but to help them. He worked with the small ranchers, the forgotten victims of Thorne's greed, helping them reclaim their land and water rights, rebuilding the community Thorne had tried to poison. He was no longer running from the law. He was becoming it in its truest, most restorative form. Months later, when a fragile order had returned to the valley, Jacob made one last journey. He rode to the small, windswept cemetery on the edge of town, to the simple wooden cross that marked Eliza's grave. The afternoon sun was warm on his back, and a gentle breeze rustled the dry grass. For 5 years, this place had been a monument to his failure. Now it was simply a place of memory. From his coat pocket, he took the silver locket. The cavalry had returned it to him, its surface now cleaned and polished. He opened the delicate clasp. Inside were not portraits, but 2 tiny, intricately folded pieces of paper. He had never looked before respecting her privacy, even in death. Now he felt he had to. He carefully unfolded the first. It was a line from a poem she loved. "My heart is ever at your service." He unfolded the second. It was a newspaper clipping yellowed with age, announcing his promotion to U.S. Marshal. Tears finally came hot and silent. They were not tears of guilt, but of release. She had loved the lawman, the man of rules and duty, the very man he had come to hate. In that moment he understood. He could not change the past, but he could honor her memory by living a life of service, not of hiding. He gently closed the locket and placed it on the wooden headstone, letting the silver catch the afternoon light. He had not just reclaimed a memory. He had forgiven himself. As he was leaving the cemetery, a voice called his name. It was Sheriff Brody, looking sober for the first time Jacob could remember. The old lawman looked thinner, his face carrying the shame of his past inaction. "Vance," Brody said, his voice hesitant. "The town council, they asked me to give you this." He held out a newly polished star, sheriff's badge. "I'm retiring. They want a real lawman, someone Thorne couldn't buy." Jacob looked at the badge glinting in Brody's hand. It was a heavy, terrible, and beautiful thing. A symbol of the rules that had cost him so much, and the order that he had just helped to restore. He thought of Eliza, of Cale, and of the long, bloody path that had brought him back to himself. For the first time in 5 years, a small, sad, but genuine smile touched his lips.